Today I'll be talking about the current practices that we can use to predict the flock health and work on enhancing performance to have a sustainable commercial chicken flocks. The first slide, I've got this 15 key management tips for poultry performance potential improvements. This is just to show that 98% of the problems are management related and only 2% that can be fixed by a veterinarian, which is disease related, or 3%, I should say. So biosecurity is on the top of the list, and if biosecurity is well maintained for a farm, we tend to get less and less problems in the farm. It is a costly exercise, but it's the insurance policy. In my previous jobs traveling internationally, there is various levels of biosecurity, and associated with it is various levels of disease challenges that you see at the farm. The approaches, today's talk is very basic and very general. I cannot accommodate everything in this 20 minutes, so I've tried to pick what is just a basic information that I can share. So the approaches is two types, two-pronged. One is active surveillance, and this consists of scheduled monitoring of flocks even in the absence of suspicion to field infection. This is basically and mostly performed in breeder flocks where vaccination is done to look at if vaccination was successful and the birds are protected, and thus the progeny is protected in broilers. Passive surveillance is usually performed when flock is sick or you have some issues, and it is mostly done when there is a problem in the field. So with the active surveillance, when you get detection of some sort, or there is some serological indication of a field infection, confirmation is important. And using serology alone, I found is not very confirmatory unless it is supported by some other tests. First of all, considering differentials is very important. It can be a fungal disease that is happening on a rooster's combs. It can be different bacterial diseases causing respiratory challenges. It can be eggshell abnormalities that you're seeing, or just a slight swelling of the feet, which can be an indication of chronic fowl cholera that's happening. Active surveillance wise, testing of water quality, which is either targeted during the seasons or annual, is very important. I believe water sanitation is very important, and good water hygiene, because the birds will drink more than what they eat in broilers, then the good quality water is very important. As Professor Steve alluded in his talk just before, there are some lessons learned from COVID. So detection of fragment of viruses, virus genetic material in water to predict outcomes can be one research point in environmental sampling and testing. Other times when we go and do some surveillance work or monitoring work or investigation work is when you see drop in production. A drop in production, there's birds not reaching peak, the breeder birds not reaching peak, or they're below. So there is no substitute for postmortem examination in the field. As you can see a variation in testis development or ovarian regression that will happen, and which may be the cause. And then a further investigation is required to see what is the actual cause. Most of the time during production, what we see is we are culling males that look weak, or that are injured, and we leave the good-looking males around. And most of the times, not all good-looking males in the shed, or the sires, I should say, in the shed, are performing, and these guys will still defend or protect their territory and avoid mating by other males for the females. So these females are not covered, so we don't get fertile eggs coming out. So it's pretty important to do postmortems, and especially testis, development tests in weights in the breeder sheds. Other times we look at data. Data is very important. Data collection and analysis is very important. It's very important to have a automated system where trends are generated by itself so that you can see actually what's happening on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. A drop in production can be easily picked up, or an increase in water consumption in birds can be easily picked up, which will show us if there is something going on in the birds or there is an animal welfare issue that is coming around the corner for us. Samples that need to be collected, and the samples usually include dust samples, which is very high on the list, as Steve had mentioned. Others are tracheal-choanal swabs, blood, which is very common and collected by almost everybody, and how to interpret those ELISA titers. I will be talking about that a little bit later. Tissues from postmortem examinations for histology and feces, feed and water, and litter samples. I just found out that we can do cocci counts from litter samples through Angela's work for Inghams. As you can see, immunosuppressive diseases is what is always very important and should always be included in your diagnosis, in your sampling, and should be on your thought process at all times. And two pictures on the right are histology pictures, which showing cocci and NDV vaccine in the gut. For most of the poultry diseases, immunity is mainly antibody mediated, and serology titers will allow evaluation of the health. And serology titers also will indicate if changes are needed based upon facts. Serology is a good screening tool that we have, and it allows us, for further evaluations. It allows us to evaluate maternal antibodies in chicks, and so that we can select optimal timing of vaccination and perform quality control. In day-old chicks, profiling of antibody levels in hyperhumanized breeder flocks will tell us if we need to boost further in production cycles, or if there is no need to boost, or there is no challenge in the production cycle. Screening to check for exposure to a disease if the flock is not vaccinated. This is where it comes handy. And most importantly is checking for efficacy of vaccine administration. That's money going into the flock, and we need to know that the money has gone down the right track in the chickens and not in the drain. And also for breed stock suppliers to confirm negative status. This slide has suggested blood collection, which I normally use. In broilers, to check for maternal antibodies, first 3 days is important, and then later to check for any seroconversion towards Newcastle disease, for example, or anything else. In broiler breeders, since the broiler pullets are vaccinated, they need to be monitored if the vaccine uptake was proper. And then in breeders, usually 8 to 10 or 10 to 12 weeks post peak. Commercial layers, I've got something down there for commercial layers as well. Sample size, to be able to get 95% confidence interval. That table on the right just shows the number of samples we need to collect to detect at least between 0.1 and 5% of infection. Normally, I target between 23 and 25 samples per flock of 10,000 birds. Different vaccination programs will set different baselines, and this is where care should be taken on how we are looking at. This is a slide where chickens, this is from Nola Ferguson, She, in Georgia, she had done a comparison between bacterian and live vaccination for Mycoplasma gallisepticum. As you can see, the live and bacterian will give higher titers compared to the live only vaccination program. So that needs to be kept in mind when creating your baselines. Different ELISA kits will have different thresholds. As you can see in IDEX compared to biocheck ELISA kits, depending on your vaccination program as well. If your birds are boosted and then birds are primed with live and then boosted with killed, you'll have a higher titer, which can be seen. I've used both kits and compared both kits, but different kits have different advantages. How do we use this serological data? Serological data, as I've said before, on its own is very difficult to make a judgment. It should be used in conjunction with postmortem findings and secondary lab findings as well. On the left, the first two bar graphs showing flocks exposed, whereas the last two are showing negatives. So that is just an indication that there's some infection that has come in. Or the middle graph on the top shows vaccination that has happened properly. And the second graph is showing the typical decay response curve of a vaccine or maternal antibody in a flock. Changes are, over a flock. You can do longitudinal studies or continual monitoring, where you can see if there is a change coming through. This especially happens with Mycoplasma, where later on in life you start to see seroconversions happening in birds, especially in birds vaccinated with the TS11 vaccine, which complicates if it is a infection or it's a vaccine reaction that's happening later on in life. That you can only conclude by looking for typical clinical syndromes such as drop-in production or clinical syndromes such as respiratory. Care has to be taken, or caution has to be taken when making decisions based on ELISA titers. Although ELISA is very useful, and the protection provided by vaccines, or the protection depends on many variables like vaccine strains that is used, virulence of field strains, type of bird, vaccination application method, schedule, and local variables like temperature and feed quality. A protective titer of 4,000 for NDV for one farm might not protect birds on the farm next door. We have to create your own in-house database, which is essential for every major intensive poultry producers. We cannot compare your database with internationally published or pre-established data, because it's the whole environment is different. With Mycoplasma, I found that there is difference between farm to farm on the same enterprise as well. Another reason is that some bacteria like Pastorella, Mycoplasma, the immunity is primarily cell-mediated, so you will not have good ELISA response or seroconversion response to measure. Therefore, titers do not directly indicate immune status in these birds. And also titers of some viruses like fowlpox or ILT do not reflect immune status. ELISA titers for these agents are very useful to monitor vaccinations. CV percentage is very important. It tells you how well your bird has been vaccinated, or is there a challenge coming through in vaccinated flocks. So the mean titer of tested birds, the coefficient of variation, as it's called, is listed in that table, which can be a guide. The lower the CV percentage, the more uniform the distribution of titers and better vaccination. And for most diseases, the percent CV after correctly should be less than 40%. I prefer 30%, but 40% is also excellent. For live vaccine applications, the CV percent should be less than 60%. There's a difference between killed and live vaccine CV percent. Serology, if you make decisions based on single time point serology, this table over here shows a paired serology that we did for MS infection. This is courtesy of Chris Morrow. And then we did a paired serology to see if there was an infection that was actually happening. Many people will not like this because we are leaving the birds open for more challenges and more production losses, but this is one of the ways to diagnose as well. So as you can see, from 39 weeks to 42 weeks of age, the birds in shed number 2 or house number 2 is completely seroconverted to positive, which was confirmed by a DIVA PCR. A DIVA PCR is where you can differentiate between infected and vaccinated animals. And Bioproperties has developed one for mycoplasma, and there's others out there in the field as well, which helps identify if the seroconversion you are seeing later on in life is actually due to vaccine or field challenges coming through to plan for an intervention for control and treatment. Identifying risk period. For targeted, this is a mycoplasma example again, Gallisepticum. This is not Australia, this is international, where the challenge for mycoplasma is way higher due to the very varying biosecurity control measures that they have for the production systems. So the knowledge of the area is there, where they know that there is a risk period when the birds are coming into lay, at point of lay, or at peak of lay, and again when they're entering their final weeks of production. So you can target a sampling early in life to confirm that the broiler breeders or the breeders are free from infection initially. If there is anything confirmed by PCR, then a treatment should be done before vaccination happens. If the birds are already vaccinated and you are trying to vaccinate using live vaccines, it's a waste of time. It's not going to give you much protection at all. And then monitoring later on allows you the opportunity to decide whether prophylactic antibiotic use is needed or not in this flock. Cocci has become quite an important control for us, especially the antibiotic free from antibiotic raising of birds. Those who don't know Cocci needs cycling in the shed. It has to go through the bird 3 times before it starts causing a lot of problem. And similarly, the vaccine needs to do the same thing through the birds. So 3 cyclings is very important in the shed after vaccination. And a vaccine, coccicycline, and a coccicycline in ionophore and chemical and ionophore controls is in the graph on the right hand side. So monitoring the flock is very important as removal of this anticoccidiostats from the feed predisposes the birds to other bacterial challenges such as necrotic enteritis that happens. So sampling per session should target about between 4 and 8. 8 to 10 is also good. And 5 birds randomly selected, healthy birds, not selecting cults or mortalities or disease birds. And then we perform scoring as per a set standard that we have. Age, the flock age in vaccinated can be from 10 days of age, but 18 to 38 days age flock is is what should be targeted for sampling. And consistency, do you stick to the scores? And how often? To get enough data to make a good decision, monthly sampling is very important. So we use a platform which is derived by Huvepharma, Avian performance platform. It's called Avian, and supplied and serviced in Australia by Nutriment Health, Rowan Wilson. And we enter all these data into the app, and the app generates a trend for us to look at and decide based on the data when and how to modify our Cocci control programs for better control of Cocci. This is very important and highly critical for us, as we do not use anticoccidials or antibiotics in the production. In summary, we always need to choose the cheapest, the rapid, and the most convenient tests. Some tests take too long to give you an answer, and that is why the answer becomes obsolete, especially when you're growing broiler chickens. In 6 weeks, 6 to 7 weeks, the broilers are out, and by the time you get your results, it's too late, or we cannot make a decision. Creating and organizing an in-house database is very essential. Like I said, not using internationally published or somebody else's baselines to make decisions. It's very risky because it depends on the region, production systems, vaccination program, and field exposure situations. I can't bring a baseline from, for example, India on mycoplasma and use it in Australia. So it's very different. And use of an automatically generating system that generates trends for you will be very beneficial. Know the power and limitation of each laboratory assay and consider secondary tests where necessary. It's very critical to avoid risky single time point evaluations. If you cannot do a secondary test such as culture or PCR, a paired serum testing is critical. There are state, federal, official regulations that need to be complied with, especially when it comes to avian influenza and Newcastle disease. That needs to be complied, especially for SA. We have to consider pathogens, what pathogens are out there, and what kind of variants are out there, because if you're using serology only, serology does not type the type of infection that's happening, and those specific tests are also needed there. Know your field disease situation and epidemiology when interpreting results. Sometimes you will find a pathogen in the tests, but you have to know if that is a prevailing cause of a problem in the area. Other things is when you need to have a collaborative approach. I call it a community approach, where all production systems, like all different companies, need to be on the same page. We in Sydney, when I was working in Sydney, all different companies, we used to have a monthly meeting for the vets, and we go for lunch. We discuss our ILT control program, which farm is vaccinated, which farm is not vaccinated, so that you can vaccinate your farm to protect it from any disease infections. So a community approach is very important, I think, in this, and know how to interpret tests quantitatively and qualitatively is important as well. Thank you. That's all from me, and I wish to thank the listed people who helped me.
We still rely on antibiotics treatment. Are there any alternatives, such as organic acids, yeast, peptide, probiotics, that have been used in biosecurity?
Well, replacing, as a vet, our main focus is the welfare of the birds. You cannot leave the birds suffering. If there is a need to use antibiotics, you use antibiotics, but we need to be one step ahead at all times. So active surveillance like water testing, your biosecurity measures that you put in place, all these are very important at all times, especially when you look at the biosecurity measures put in for breeder operations in Australia. That is the reason we don't have that much of bacteria. There are products out there. There are snake oils out there that you can use. It's for me, it's more of a hit and a miss. Sometimes you get very good results with these probiotics or prebiotics, and sometimes you don't get any response at all. But there are some good products that help immunomodulate the birds.
Thank you, Robin. The next question, for the CV values for titers, should these be based on the raw titer or log titer value?
I usually use the raw titer, but having a database system where it automatically calculates and tells you what's the CV-based system. Different tests will come with their own analysis systems. Different kits will have their own analysis systems, so it will give you the CVs based on raw data, or either is good.
From your experience, would you be able to recommend when people are thinking about their on-farm database, what good systems are out there?
Wherever I've worked, we've created our own database system. It's a basic Excel system. There are other systems that are out there, in commercial, some companies who do that. But just to begin with, just basic Excel sheet database that can give you, that can generate graphs for you is what is very important. Capturing data is more important initially, and then a constant monitoring or watching of the data. For AVFs, it's a very good tool, I can say, which helps. It not only looks at the CV, the cocci lesions that we are scoring every month. It also captures data for us for femoral head necrosis, for tibial chondrodysplasias, for all the other things that we feel is important. So there are others which I cannot say off the top of my head at the moment, but simple Excel sheets.
Thanks very much, Robin.